Hi folks, and welcome to this video which covers language learning theory and the role of memory. I've touched on these topics very briefly before, but here I'll go into a little more depth. I want to begin with the very first line from Dave Willis's 2003 book, Rules, Patterns and Words. He says, "Whenever we do anything in the classroom, we're acting on our beliefs about language and language learning." Now this may seem blindingly obvious, but in my experience this fundamental need to link English teaching practice to language learning theory is very frequently overlooked, and in many cases because the teacher knows very little about language learning theory. Now I don't want to bombard you with too many quotes, but I must draw your attention to 3 points made by Michael Lewis in his 1993 book, The Lexical Approach. The first is that the grammatical syllabus used in most commercially available coursebooks persists even though serious work in linguistics has discredited this approach. The second is that trainees on a typical 4-week TEFL training course are frequently left with the impression that there is a way of teaching which is all about presenting and practicing grammar. And the third is that many teachers' methodology is derived almost exclusively from coursebooks, rather than from a coherent theoretical overview of the nature of language and learning. So to sum up, much of the content of coursebooks goes against what we know about language teaching and learning. Training courses reinforce these ideas, and teachers follow them without any real knowledge of the nature of language learning. Even though these quotes come from a book published over 20 years ago, the situation is the same today, and these erroneous views are perhaps even more entrenched. Clearly this isn't a great situation, so in the next 20 minutes I want to have a brief look at what we know about learning in general and language learning in particular, and to try and go some way to providing that coherent theoretical overview which Lewis said most TEFL teachers lack. So what do we know about language learning? Well, the logical place to start is to look at the process of learning our first language. I've mapped out the significant stages on this timeline, so the years run along the bottom. We start by being exposed to a great deal of language for about 18 months without saying anything meaningful. We then begin to say individual words, and then between the ages of 2 and 3 we make combinations of 2 and 3 words. Between the ages of 3 and 4 we progress to combining words in very simple but usually grammatically inaccurate sentences. From the age of 4 we develop a communicative competence which allows us to function in most situations, although our language continues to contain many inaccuracies and we struggle to understand or explain more complex ideas. By the time we enter our teens, we've mastered phonology and grammar and are able to speak fluently and accurately due to constant exposure to and practice of the language. So exposure to the language, engagement with the language, and the motivation to communicate by using the language take us from inaccurate yet communicative fluency towards accurate fluency without ever having grammar rules explicitly explained to us. Clearly the circumstances for learning a foreign language are not exactly the same as this, but the learning process follows the same pattern. Lots of exposure to understandable language is required, along with motivation and engagement, and we go from very basic and inaccurate language towards more complex and more accurate language. Most TEFL course books, however, follow a grammar syllabus which is based on the opposite idea, that from accurately mastering and then building on blocks of grammar, students will achieve accurate fluency. And this is where the problem lies. While not everything in EFL coursebooks is bad, the fundamental emphasis on grammatical accuracy is misplaced, and many teachers are unaware of the evidence that is out there which discredits what I'll call the standard coursebook approach. Now, besides exposure, motivation and engagement, the other crucial element in language learning is memory. On the very first page of his 2011 book, Memory Activities for Language Learning, Nick Bilbrough says, "There is no learning without remembering, and language learning, perhaps more than most other forms of learning, places huge demands on memory. And memory underpins every aspect of successful language learning." He's undoubtedly correct, but he's certainly not the first person to realise this. Dr. Caleb Giteño was putting forward ideas about the role of memory half a century ago in the 1960s. Although he spoke several languages, the Egyptian-born Giteño was actually a mathematician rather than a linguist. But in 1963 he published Teaching Foreign Languages in Schools, the Silent Way. The title comes from the belief that teachers should talk as little as possible in order to allow the students more time to speak. Putting teacher silence at the centre of the method and in the title of the book probably made the approach seem rather too radical for mainstream classroom teaching, and meant that Gattegno's name is not nearly as well known among language teachers today as it probably should be. However, it was Gattegno, with his background in maths, who brought an evidence-based approach to solving the problems of language teaching. The main principle of the silent way is the subordination of teaching to learning. Gattegno argued that for teaching to be effective, teachers must understand how people learn. Rather than present facts for memorization, teachers should construct challenges for students to conquer. If the student cannot conquer the challenge easily, the teacher doesn't reveal the answer, but guides the student towards it, essentially creating motivation and encouraging engagement. This is essentially what we now refer to as task-based learning. So far so good, but here's where it gets interesting. Gattegno identified two different types of remembering. He called them retention and memorization. We retain effortlessly, using mental images created from our various senses. It's our retention system which allows us to know where our local supermarket stocks tea and tomatoes, to find our way around our town and round the town where we went on holiday 10 years ago. We all have images of places dating from our childhood, showing how long-lived the process of retention can be. Memorization, in contrast, costs a great deal in terms of effort and is notoriously unreliable. Gattegno noticed that there's an energy budget for learning. Those who memorize must keep revising, that is, expending more energy, or they forget. So the silent way was directed towards students retaining the language rather than memorizing it. The method emphasizes the autonomy of the learner. The teacher's role is to monitor the students' efforts, and the students are encouraged to have an active role in learning the language. Pronunciation is seen as fundamental. Beginning students start their study with pronunciation, and much time is spent practicing it in each lesson. Gattegno also saw the choice of which vocabulary to teach as vital to the language learning process. He advised teachers to concentrate on the most functional and versatile words to help students build a functional vocabulary. Now let's jump forward a couple of decades and look at the work of the American linguist Stephen Krashen, previously of the University of Southern California. He put forward 5 hypotheses regarding second language acquisition in books published in the early 1980s. His main idea was the input hypothesis, and he argues that it has yet to be disproved. He says we acquire language in one way and only one way, when we obtain comprehensible input, when we understand what we hear or read in another language. Grammar, vocabulary and all that stuff is the result of understanding language. He adds that language acquisition is most effective when the input is not just comprehensible, but really interesting, even compelling. So interesting that you forget you are listening to or reading another language. So we're back to those key elements of exposure and engagement. Krashen's other important idea was the acquisition learning hypothesis, which bears a strong resemblance to Gattegno's distinction between retention and memorization. Krashen sees acquisition as a purely subconscious process and learning as a conscious process, and claims that improvement in language ability is only dependent upon acquisition and never on learning. Krashen's hypotheses have been criticised because they can't be scientifically proven or disproven, but they resonate with many people's experience of language learning. Coming a little more up to date, in 2001, the American neuroscientist Michael T. Ullman, professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., put forward his declarative procedural model of language. Ullman's study goes into some depth, but the most significant point is that the DP model highlights 2 memory systems, the declarative and the procedural. I should point out here that while these different memory functions happen in different parts of the brain, it's not a simple left-right split. This is just my way of illustrating that we're dealing with 2 different memory systems. Declarative memory is what we use to learn and use knowledge about facts and events, such as the fact that Kilimanjaro is the highest mountain in Africa, or that you had onion soup for lunch yesterday. Procedural memory is what we use to learn those cognitive skills which become non-conscious or automatic, such as typing, riding a bicycle, or video game playing. Learning in the procedural memory system is about sequences and rules. It requires extended practice, but seems to result in more rapid and automatic processing of skills and knowledge than learning in declarative memory. Now, where language is concerned, this means that we use declarative memory to learn and store our mental lexicon, i.e. vocabulary, while it's procedural memory that underlies our mastery of the rule-governed sequencing of complex forms and syntax, i.e. grammar. For example, knowing to add the ed ending to walk to form the past tense, or using the definite article with the noun cat. However, we can also use our declarative memory to learn words and phrases like walked or the cat as chunks of language, so complex forms can rely on either memory system. If you think about student errors, this would explain why students will use grammar correctly in one sentence, but then fail to successfully apply it in a subsequent situation. So to sum up so far, 1. Learners need the motivation to learn, lots of exposure to the language, and they need to be engaged. 2. There are two types of memory, and learning in the procedural memory, which is used to make sense of grammar, requires extended practice, more than can be provided in a classroom environment. 3. Any explicit teaching of grammar rules seems to have little effect on this process. And 4. Emphasis on grammatical accuracy is misplaced because this is a late acquired feature of all language learning. So from what we know about language learning, this fixation with accuracy and grammar rules is taking us down a linguistic cul-de-sac and wasting class time. Instead, we'd be better off directing our efforts towards helping students learn individual words and phrases using declarative memory. But what's the best way of going about this? In order to answer that question, we need to understand how memory works. Very briefly, it works like this. In order to remember something, information has to be transferred from the short-term memory, where it will be forgotten, to the long-term memory, where it will be remembered. For this to happen, engagement, motivation and exposure are essential, those key elements again. Information is organised in neural networks known as schemas, and in this process, the meaningfulness or emotional content of an item is important. That's engagement. And when there is no motivation to remember something new, it just disappears from our short-term memory and we forget it. And we also forget things we think we've already learned when they don't have enough connections in our memory networks. That's engagement again. And when they are not used often enough. That's exposure. The importance of connections in our memory network was illustrated by the American science journalist Joshua Foer in his 2012 TED Talk when he explained the Baker-Baker paradox. It goes like this. You tell two people to remember the same word. To the first person you say, remember that there's a guy named Baker. To the second person you say, remember that there's a guy who is a baker. At some time in the future, you go back to those two people and ask them what the word you asked them to remember was. The person who was told the guy's name was Baker is less likely to remember the word than the person who was told the guy is a baker. The reason for this is that the name Baker doesn't actually mean anything to you. It's entirely untethered from all the other memories floating around in your skull. But the common noun baker has meaning for us. Bakers make bread, they wear funny white hats, they start work very early, etc. When we first hear that word, we start putting these associational hooks into it that make it easier to fish it back out at some later date. Now let's go into a little more depth. To understand how memory works, and more importantly its limitations, we need to start by going back to the mid-19th century and the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus. He came up with the notion of the forgetting curve to illustrate how we forget things over time, and his experiments showed that we forget about 75% of what we learn after just 48 hours. It's a fact that unless you actively take steps to retain the key points of what you hear, you will actually remember very little. That's no reflection on you personally, or me and my presentation for that matter. It's just the way our brains work. Ebbinghaus discovered that the best way to counteract the way we naturally forget things is spaced repetition, or to put it another way, repeated exposure. That means that if you're going to remember the content of this presentation, you should watch it again next week, and again the week after that, and again the week after that, and so on. Now I'm guessing that's not going to happen, so what else can you do to prevent my words of wisdom from just disappearing into the ether? Well, if we travel forward about 100 years to 1939, the psychologist H.F. Spitzer showed that encoding what has been said, either by repeating it or by taking notes, can help to counter the brain's tendency to forget. In Spitzer's study, some subjects merely read materials, while others recited the information in their own words immediately after reading it. 7 days later, those who had simply read the information could only remember 33% of what they had read. Those who had recited it remembered 83%. Engagement clearly helps. So for learners, the act of remembering requires the right kind of effort in mental processing for it to be effective. And as a teacher, you have to be aware that you're essentially in the memory business as well. Your lesson may not be about memorising the order of a deck of cards, but it's still all about memory. Your lesson may be well planned and perfectly structured, but if the students forget most of it after a couple of days, you would have to concede that it was mostly a waste of time. So how do we make things memorable? In their 2007 book, Made to Stick, Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die, American educational psychologists Chip and Dan Heath explain what makes an idea or concept memorable or interesting. The book's outline follows the acronym SUCCESS, with the last S omitted. Each letter refers to a characteristic that can help make an idea sticky, i.e. memorable. Simple. Find the core of any idea. Unexpected. Grab people's attention by surprising them. Concrete. Make sure an idea can be grasped and remembered later. Credible. Give an idea believability. Emotional. Things which amuse, arouse or annoy us. Stories. Anecdotes are better than dry lists of facts. I won't go into these categories in any more depth here because I think the list is pretty much self-explanatory. Obviously your lesson content doesn't have to have all of these characteristics, but the more it has, the more memorable it's likely to be. Okay, so that's a very brief look at language learning theory and memory. Now I'll end with a very quick summary of some of the practical implications of all this theory for our teaching. Encourage students to use the language without worrying about making mistakes. Accuracy will come in time. And remind students that only they can learn the language. You can't do it for them. Use content that will interest your students to provide plenty of understandable exposure to the language. Don't spend lots of time on explanations of grammar rules followed by exercises. They're unlikely to be remembered. Instead, focus on vocabulary building through memorable activities. Make students aware of strategies they can use to remember more and therefore become more effective learners. Engage students through meaningful activities such as acting out short dialogues, problem solving, quizzes, writing journals, and by generally encouraging creativity. Okay, that's all for this video. Thanks for listening, and I hope it was useful.